Newcomers, we're excited to have you here with us today. 10 seasons, we have been bringing valuable conversations and insights to the table through the Your Brain at Work digital community. And we're thrilled to continue evolving and experimenting bravely as we bring fresh insights, guests, and ideas to our audience. Today, we're going to be recapping the 2023 NeuroLeadership Summit that we had in New York City a few weeks ago. It was 2 days packed with incredible panels, speakers, and experiences for attendees. We gained so much, and in the next hour, we're going to share highlights with you all. But quickly, before we get into that, we're going to do a few housekeeping notes. We appreciate our Zoom participants, as well as our friends streaming across our social platforms. And regardless of what platform you're on, let us know in the comments section. Speaking of comments, just a quick reminder in Zoom, make sure that you select everyone or all panelists and attendees before you post so we can see them. So where are you guys joining in from? Share in the chat. Florida, North Carolina, Michigan. Nice. It's so great to have you all here. We're recording today's session, so if you're interested in a replay, be on the lookout for an email later today. That email is going to include a survey for feedback and a number of resources that are aligned to today's conversation. We're also going to be introducing a fun new polling experience at the end of the show to continue partnering with our research team, so make sure that you stick around. We also suggest putting your phone on Do Not Disturb, quitting out of your email and messaging apps so that you can get the most out of today's discussion. And as always, we love interaction, so feel free to share your thoughts and comments in the chat. Now, to get this incredible session underway, I'm going to pass it over to the phenomenal John Edwards, our Director of Leadership, who also served as our Master of Ceremonies at this year's 2023 Summit. Thanks for being here, John, and I'm passing it over to you.
Oh, thank you so much. Hello, friends. What a privilege and a pleasure it is to be here with you. And wow, to see the international audience that's joining us here today, from Finland to the Czech Republic to India to New Jersey and my own backyard of North Carolina. So happy to serve as your host today for this incredible discussion from 3 world global leaders on their intake from and insights from this year's summit. You know, as you may know, the NeuroLeadership Summit started in 2007. And so we have had this annual summit continuing with a very large virtual presence last year. And then just excited to have seen so many of you in New York recently for our first ever hybrid summit. We had 2,000 of you streaming at one point, and we had over 56 countries represented and attendees. We had over 50 speakers supporting this summit, and experts from around the world, and 22 learning sessions. And the purpose of the summit is to generate insights, to discuss really big ideas, to learn what's the latest in neuroscience research and how they can be applied to help you accelerate your success. And it was just an exciting time. So looking forward to hearing from our panelists today around their biggest takeaways from that summit. And with that, it is my privilege and my pleasure to get to the point where we get to introduce our panelists. And now here's what you can expect. As each panelist comes online, they're going to share with you one of their stickiest memories from the summit. Now, I love using the word stickiest because it's like what's stuck with your mind the most, right? What kind of insight did you have? And so they'll share that with us, but and then they'll also share a little bit later greater details around that as well. Hey, we want to encourage you to write down your stickiest moments from this discussion. In fact, I'd encourage you right now to get a pen, paper, pencil, crayon, whatever you might be able to grab. And when these insights occur, go ahead and write them out right as they're occurring. And in fact, later on in our discussion today, we'd like to ask you to share them in the chat box as well. So looking forward to hearing from you as we continue our interactive time together. All right, let's get on with it. Our first guest, our first panelist today is Janet Stovall. Now, Janet is the global head of DEI here at the NeuroLeadership Institute. She loves cooking Cajun meals, so I can't wait to get a chance to visit with her. But here's the other thing. As global head of DEI, there's only one diverse identity that kind of scares Janet a little bit. As it turns out, it's the Easter Bunny. True story. Now, I pondered that for a little while, trying to figure out what the deal was there. And the only thing I can come up with is this. When you think about the Easter Bunny, it's the only creature that breaks into your house illegally and then leaves a bunch of eggs behind, and we're supposed to be excited about it. I mean, if it was any other day other than Easter, you and I would consider that an infestation and call the exterminator. So I don't know, maybe that's one of the reasons why Janet has a thing about the Easter Bunny. Janet, welcome to our webinar today?
Thank you, John. And you're absolutely right. It not only breaks into your house, it's big enough to carry a basket. I don't want to see it. I am thrilled to be here today. And my general overview of what I came from the summit was this. It's a correction, not a catastrophe. It's complex, not complicated. And the way we're going to deal with it is through coherence, not contention.
Oh, wow, that's good. I can't wait to hear a little more about that from you as we continue our conversation today. Thank you, Janet. Hey, our next panelist today is Matt Summers. He's the Global Head of Culture and Leadership here at DEI. Now, Matt loves to shark scuba dive. That's right. You heard it correctly. He likes to scuba dive, both he and his wife, with sharks. He also likes to snowboard, but to the best of my knowledge, he has never done both of them at the same time. Now, let's give a warm welcome to Matt Summers. Welcome, Matt.
Thanks so much, John. And yes, I'm curious to see if anybody's ever attempted to do both at the same time, but not in my history. Great to be here. Thanks for having us, John. A couple of big takeaways for us that we're going to explore today from the summit is that, I would say we're having a major reboot in the industry of both culture and leadership as we try to really reevaluate and recalibrate around building leadership pipelines, reinvesting in human capital, and doing so through science. So really excited about that and the impact that we can have over the next 5 years. Thanks, John.
Oh, fascinating, fascinating. Thank you. Appreciate that, Matt. Our next panelist is a Global Head of Talent and Performance, Christy Pruitt-Haynes. Now, she has completed her first book. We're pretty excited about that. And she can also do a handstand in the pool. So if you happen to be in the same hotel that we're in when we're traveling and you walk down the hallway and all you see are 2 feet coming out of the pool, you'll have a clear understanding of what's going on. Hello, Christy. Welcome to our panel.
Thank you so much, John. Yes, unfortunately, I can't do a handstand on dry land for some reason, but you put me in water and I am set. So glad to be here with you all. A couple of the insights we're going to talk about today is the importance of organizational culture when you are creating high performers. We oftentimes think about the skills we need in individuals, but there are also some traits that your organization needs in order to truly create and enable high performers. So I look forward to talking about that more in just a bit.
Great. Thank you, Christy. Hey, folks, let's go ahead and jump in. What we'd like to do today is have each of our panelists share trends, insights, recap of the greatest takeaways from the sessions that fall into their particular role as practice leaders. And then we'd like to have a general discussion amongst all the panelists as we're learning from each other here. But we also want to learn from you. And once again, just a quick reminder, what's stickiest for you? What kind of insights are you getting as you're listening to these? Go ahead and share them in the chat box. We also hope to have some time for questions and answers. So feel free to place your questions and answers in the Q&A box as well. And we'll try to keep an eye out for those and create some time at the end to be able to talk with you about these as we continue through our time together. So we'll start with Janet. Janet, as you looked across the landscape of the remarkable presenters that talked about DE&I at the summit this year, I'm wondering what kinds of trends did you notice? What kinds of insights did you gain? What kind of information would you like to share with us today?
Thanks, John. Well, one theme that I did not expect that I thought I was seeing while I was there, but came to me later, I'll explain that. Back in 1926, it was right in the middle of the great artistic movement, Harlem Renaissance, Arthur James Baldwin said, "We now intend to express our individual dark-skinned selves without fear or shame." Nowadays, what he said then about Black creatives can be said about pretty much all of us. We all want the freedom to be who we believe we are, to lean into whatever identity or identities plural that we believe to be important. Now, that idea was surfaced by Lindsay Ray McIntyre from Microsoft during the keynote panel. And what I realized after the fact, thinking about all we did there, is that it explains everything that's going on in DEI now and what's going to drive it forward in the future. And it tied together every one of the 3 DEI discussions that we had at Summit. See, it's the reason that DEI is inevitable, but it's also cyclical and it's also fluid. Kenji Yoshino stressed that when he was talking about the recent SCOTUS decision on affirmative action. We are smack dab, he said, in the middle of the irresistible force paradox. What happens when an irresistible force meets an immovable object? Well, that irresistible force, well, that's federal law. Diversity, which is a fundamental American right and an individual demand, is a movable object. And what happens when they meet is that the object changes. It doesn't move, it transforms. Khalil Smith then echoed that when he discussed how organizations navigate the stay woke, go broke era, namely that they can stay woke and they won't go broke by knowing their unique value propositions and then sticking to them, making it an immovable object. So basically, organizations and individuals may change how they respond to all the irresistible forces of changing law and public opinion that we're seeing in DEI right now, but they don't have to move away from who they truly are. And then we heard how that operates in real life from the field case studies. We had Michael Barker from Medtronic, Tina Drew from the Salt River Project, and Adonica Black from LexisNexis. And they shared what their particular organizations are doing in DEI and how they're doing what they need to do uniquely based on who they are. Travis Jones, who's an NLI senior DEI consultant, and he was the moderator for that panel, said it even better. He said, every industry and every organization has its own unique challenges. DEI shines brightest when it meets those challenges where they are. And that's what organizations that are winning at this are trying to do. But people aren't the only ones who are demanding to be who they are. Organizations are doing that too. And in retrospect, I can see how this demand to be who we choose to be came up in my second panel discussion. I told you to tie them all together. And that one was about the tension-filled divide between the moral case and the business case for DEI. It also surfaced a second theme, the importance of metrics in supporting our ability to be who we demand to be. When we started getting ready for Summit and we were talking to our speakers and pulling our panels together, I had several conversations with Dr. Jordan Spark, and we started out on that issue of the moral versus the business case diametrically opposed. But we ended up being, like the topic said, inexorably linked. Because one key point from his research was interesting to me. Marginalized groups prefer organizations that have a moral base for inclusion. What that says to me is that we want our diversity to be seen and valued because we value it. However, the only way organizations can see the difference that we demand to be seen is if they collect data and disaggregate it, their people data. Aggregated data hides the truth and it hides who we really are. Valerie Rainford spoke to that. And her point, and the bridge between the moral and business cases we discovered, is that disaggregated data is how you shine a flashlight on differences so you can put a spotlight on equity. Or, as she said it even better, where there are inequitable outcomes, there are inequitable systems driving them. Katie Kale then, head of GSA, the General Services Administration for the federal government, took that a little bit further because she explained how her division, one division of the federal government that irresistible force, was actually working to make systems equitable. And she said it this way. She said, administrations change, but you have to bake equity into systems to sustain it. That all pointed to one other big underlying theme. DEI is a long game. Since the civil rights movement ushered DEI into the workplace, there's always been some force and some people trying to usher it right back out. So things may look scary right now, but this is just what DEI does. It's just the way it happens. It's one step forward. I'm not going to say two steps back. I'm going to say one step forward, one step back. We are living in a correction. This is not a catastrophe. And so the organizations and individuals that win are those that know who they are, value what they bring, and are willing to stand firm on what they believe. So in summary, my key insights were because we all want to be seen for who we are, and that's not going to change, DEI is an immovable force. Metrics are what drive equity, and in DEI, the long game wins. So see, correction, not catastrophe, complex, not complicated, coherence, not contention. Now, what are we going to do at NLI with all these insights? Well, you may have heard me speak to our point of view on DEI that focuses on business outcomes, brains in the business over bodies in the building. Well, we're expanding that point of view. So in addition to articles and discussions out there about the DEI business case 2.0, which is what we call it, we'll also be talking about the DEI moral case 2.0, which explains the role of right thing to do and how it really affects business outcomes. Then after that, look for us talking about the DEI coherence case, which explains how the two come together to create successful, sustainable organizations. And then keep an eye out for how we're going to be creating practical science-based solutions based on that research, based on that point of view, to help organizations tap into the value of the diverse environments that they're working so hard to create. So I welcome now some insight and some thoughts on what I just said from my fellow practice leads. Throw it at me, guys.
Thank you, Janet. Christy, Matt, what thoughts are showing up for you as you reflect on what you've just heard?
I'll jump in. The first thing is I love the way Janet talks about DEI. And I think the notion that it's an immovable force really, really resonated with me because it reminds us all that this is a long game. This is here to stay. And this does matter and affect all of us. So often, I think when people hear diversity, they think women or racial minorities. But the truth is, as Janet pointed out, all of us, no matter our identity, want to be seen and accepted for who we are. So when we look at it through that lens, it reminds us that DEI, and I'm going to say especially the inclusion piece, that affects everyone because that's something we're all looking for. And I think when we really think about it that way, it helps us to prioritize it. It helps us to understand why it matters so much. And it helps organizations to really implement it in an effective way. So that's one of the things that it kind of bubbled up for me.
Yeah, Christy, I can lean in here. And Shelby, just so you know, my camera, I'm unable to activate it. So if you could activate that, thanks. So to build on that, Janet, as I listened to some of these sessions live in New York last week, what really stood out for me is the connection between building this common ground. And what I mean by that is finding the common ground of language. It's about finding common ground of understanding. And when people have that common language, they can integrate that into the day-to-day flow of work, right? The challenge with that is that we can't do that when people are operating from different systems of language, when they're operating from different lenses of difference. And we see that in the workplace every single day. And the question is how do we create that baseline, right? How do we create that baseline of understanding? And I think we have a really great approach leading through science here at NLI on how we can do that. But I think what we have to do is we have to do that one step at a time. We can't expect that to happen all at once because we attended a 90-minute session in the four walls of a classroom, right? All right, looks like I can share my video. Hey, so in that context, I think what's really important for me is I think about my role and my responsibility as an employee and as a colleague is to take ownership of that, right? What's my role that I can play in this conversation right now? Thanks.
Great.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks to our panelists. And hey, some of you have already started putting things into the chat box to share your insights. I'd love to give the rest of you a moment to go ahead and do the same thing. What have you heard today that really stuck with you, that really sort of popped out? And go ahead and share those in the chat box if you wouldn't mind. I see some things coming in already that are of great value. By the way, while you're sharing in the chat box, you're actually helping to accelerate the learning of the rest of us that are participating as well. So thank you for being part of that. Yeah. Great things coming in here as we scan through these comments in the chat box and some things that really stuck for folks. Awesome. Fantastic. Yeah. And even some of you that were at the conference. Great. Good. This work is about the commitment, not about the law. Yeah. Brilliant. Yep. See the integration of business case and the moral case. Appreciation for that. Collaboration rather than division. You're correct there, Danny. Everybody wins. All right, fantastic. Yeah, and picking up on some of the things that Janet said, this is a long game. It's a correction, not a catastrophe. Yeah, brains in the business over bodies in the building. Yeah, I picked up on that too. That resonated with me as well. Great. Good stuff coming in. Thank you all for sharing there. DEI shines when it meets organizations where they are and the people in those organizations. Fantastic. Good. Great stuff going on here. Continue to provide those in the chat box. We appreciate your reflections and your sharing of insights. Hey, next, let's go ahead and hear from Matt Summers. And Matt, well, we're very curious as the global head of our practice for leadership. What were some of the things that showed up for you powerfully at this recent summit?
Yeah, thanks, John. I think I'll give our brains some placement. I'm a big data nerd, so I'll lead the conversation with some really interesting current trends just in the last 6 months in some specific areas. One is around the keynote that we heard on day one around how do we make AI work at work? And you'll see this on the next slides, just on this framework. And we'll talk a little bit about what are the statistics we're seeing across multiple industries at a global scale, not just a North American scale. That's important. The second thing that I want to dive into is some of the trends that we see and that we discussed on stage on how do we solve for this leadership pipeline crisis that we're all facing in organizations. I'm talking about the disinvestment in human capital and the disinvestment in learning in post-pandemic era. And how do we recalibrate that, right? It is a course correction. It's not a catastrophe, in using Janet's language. And then finally, from the field, we talked about with this really rich panel about what are organizations currently doing to apply a science-based best practice to build in the right habits at the right time, at the right scale, to create the right culture and build leadership in meaningful ways, given the uncertainty in our organizational world. So we'll talk about that. So why don't we dive into this? And on the next slide, I'd like to just share some stats and some data with you, as I mentioned. You'll see this here around investment. And what we're seeing here is we're seeing that there's a global trend that IT departments are investing. Organizations are investing in technology, and they're investing in IT. So their spend is going up by 5% just this year. However, there's a large disinvestment in building out L&D strategies and spending on programs for building and supporting leadership pathways and leadership skill sets this year in 2023. 49% is that number. That's a frightening statistic. And what that tells me is, and what we saw at the summit on stage, was there's this current trend in organizations that there's this gap that we currently need to close. And so how do we shift this disinvestment in human capital in leadership skill builds to a reinvestment? So really shifting our focus. And this focus should be around building coherent models of leadership development, not sporadic models of leadership development. So what we typically notice as consultants is that organizations that come to us have diametrically opposed leadership skill set and opportunities for learning and growth in pockets of the business. They're not coherently blended. And so there's no linkage, there's no connection to the organizational priorities, there's no connection to the central theme or central habits that are shared across the organization at scale. And then finally, of course, there's no real systems that support that learning in the day-to-day flow of work. And we discussed this on stage. We heard from some of our panelists on how they're making this work effectively. But let's talk about AI for just a second. What we heard in the opening panel and the opening keynote was that organizations are starting to get really sneaky and in a way that really excites me, because I'm a bit of an AI tech geek and I embrace AI in my day-to-day phone work. And I'll give you some examples of how I use AI. But what we heard is that, for example, we are now starting to see experimentation in AI in various industries. One case in point is in the healthcare industry. So in North America, there's an organization that is currently experimenting across 27 different sites where they are implementing what they call AI black box technology. And what this is having multiple intersect points of data to provide the operating room, so the surgeons, the charge head nurses, the support nurses, etc., that are in that room. Traditionally in healthcare, what we see in operating rooms is what happens in the operating room stays in the operating room, right? Meaning there's no learning or growth, and often the surgeon is the most senior person or power from status perspective. So that's the default input. This AI technology, black box technology, by having cameras in the room, having voice inputs, and gathering data, there are literally thousands of data inputs after every surgery that then that particular team in that operating room will get feedback on. What it's doing is it's fundamentally changing the impact on a loss of life for human error in the operating room, and it's changing the way that those that are in the operating room communicate and create clarity, right, in their processes for that patient. So that really takes that lens of patient first, but leveraging AI to do that effectively. Other things we heard in that keynote was the implementation of bots. So in the industry of AI and in organizations, we're seeing them being called bots or co-pilots. So these co-pilots are essentially AI pieces of technology that allow us to explore our thinking further. And I think the key point in that demonstration of how we're we're seeing bot technology show up on websites or in learning, is we need to use that bot technology or copilots to be an extension of our thinking. So if you're thinking about this, maybe write this down, because I think this is a key insight, is we want it to be an extension of our thinking, not a replacement for our thinking, right? And so what I mean by that is we can use ChatGPT, we can use Fathom AI as a meeting recorder to capture those insights, the critical information, but it should be a part of our thinking that informs additional thinking, not to replace our thinking. And I think that's where we're getting stuck in organizations. We're in a threat space in AI because we're uncertain about A, first of all, how's it being used? B, am I going to lose my job? And C, what's the quality of the data? And so, I'll give a good example. I use a piece of technology that records all of our meetings, all the meetings, and I go back before my next meeting and just watch the critical information from that piece of technology. It's called Fathom. I use it to capture critical information, next steps, insights, etc. Very powerful. What does it do? It saves me time. It gives me a quick update cognitively, so I'm ready for the next meeting, instead of having to call people and say, hey, what did we talk about as next actions before we go into this meeting? The last thing I'll say about the artificial intelligence is that as we overcome our fear for investing in AI, Satya Nadella said this just a week ago in an interview when asked about how big does he think AI really is? And he said it's bigger than the internet, right? And what he meant by that was it's rapidly growing, faster than we've seen growth across Facebook or any other platforms in the history. So we had over 100 million users subscribe to ChatGPT in the first 5 days of its launch. I mean, that's profound, right? And so we can't hide from it. We have to embrace it. The question is how, and how do we do that coherently in our day-to-day flow of work, right? All right, if we move on to the next slide, what you'll see here are some really scary statistics of this other trend that we talked about on stage. And this is how we are disinvesting and then the byproduct of disinvestment in human capital. So 70% of leaders considered quitting last year. That's a frightening statistic. We have to ask ourselves why. We're accountable to that in organizations. The other piece in North America is that in 7 years, by the year 2030, 1.8 million senior executives and 3.3 million managers are going to be leaving organizations. Think about that gap, right? And so that influences, of course, how we invest in new managers, or how we should be, but we're not. So we're just trying to rapidly firefight instead of invest and get ahead of it. And 60% of new managers fell within 2 years, right? So this whole notion of this noble notion of being a leader is being diluted because of the experience that leaders are going through. We'll talk about that in a second. And then finally, one in two managers quit. 1 or 2 employees quit due to manager not the company, right? So how are we failing at an epic global scale in supporting our managers in the culture of leadership, right? All right, let's lean into this next piece of information on this next slide. What you'll see here is the predictable responses that we see in leaders that we talked about at the summit. And when I was on stage with some of our key clients from aerospace, from T-Mobile, from Simon & Kucher, a number of global organizations that talked about this common ground. And what we refer to in this common ground of this shared experience is that leaders are feeling torn. What are they feeling torn? They're tired, right, of having to compromise their values and standards day in, day out. They are feeling absolutely cognitively burnt out, overwhelmed by these competing priorities. They're resigned to, well, I guess this is what now leadership means, right? And they're neglected by those that could help them, but are experiencing the same thing themselves, so they can't help others, right? Why is this? Because they're operating in what we talked about at Summit, a VUCA world. VUCA, some of you will be familiar with this acronym. If you're not, grab a pen. It's this reality, and it stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So VUCA is volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And that's the daily reality, the ecosystem, the environment in which our managers and leaders as a culture are operating in. And it creates this burnout, it creates this automatic myopic level of thinking. And we heard, from some of our panelists on stage about how they see this in the day-to-day interactions and the operations from managers, this low level of thinking, and how do we lift up to really focus on why we're doing this work, what's our purpose, so that we can get into that prefrontal cortex, that executive functioning of the brain, to make better decisions, to collaborate more effectively, right? All right, so a couple more statistics just before we wrap up here, John, on the next slide here. We can't ignore the trend of millennials, right? So in the from the field session, we had a really interesting conversation about the impact that millennials are currently having in an organization and that they're going to have in the next couple of years. And I mean 2 years, not 10 years, right? 60% of new managers say they receive no training for their role, right? From a millennial perspective, 75% of the workforce will be millennials by 2025. All right, so what is that gap? And then the question then is 91% of millennials will stay in their jobs for fewer than 3 years. What are we going to do to engage them, to make them feel valued, seen, and heard as we invest in them for the future, right? All right, the final trend I'll just share with you here as we summarize and open up the panel here is this notion that we need to scale habits across the organization, right? And what we've seen in organizations, and we discussed this at Summit at length, is organizations are lagging. What I mean by that, in their strategy to build leadership support, build culture at scale across the whole organization, they're stuck in this place of, you know, taking a lot of leadership competencies and skills and bringing them down to a few, but they do it very slowly in pockets across the organization, and it's not coherently connected. What we're saying, and a science-based approach to this is, you know, we want to get a little to everyone really quickly. So get one habit at a time across the whole organization at scale really quickly. That's where you see that's our definition of true culture transformation. Really powerful, right? All right, so John, at that point, I think I'll pause and invite, Christy and Janet and you into the dialogue. When we think about some of these key insights that AI is bigger than the internet, right? That building coherence really matters. And what we mean by coherence is building those intersects across all parts of the organization to ensure that they're aligned to the priorities of the organization, that leaders are feeling invested in, and they are being supported in the right ways, not just in a way, and that our social learning experiences are the future of adult learning, meaning we have to build learning with the brain in mind and not just put people in the four walls of the classroom. Christy, Janet, what's coming up for you?
Well, you can probably not surprised to what I'm going to say, but I was really struck by your comment about AI and the fact that people are in a threat state about it. From a DEI standpoint, people are definitely in a threat state about it because, there's a whole issue of bias in AI. And so that's a new kind of threat that's out there. And I remember that one of the discussions that we had was one of the panels you were on, and there was a little bit of discussion of that. And it was all about saying we need to pay attention to who's building it and try to figure out where the bias is in it. So when we talk about building coherence, to me, that's part of what needs to happen in the AI space. There needs to be coherence across the space, that getting bias out is important, and that we need to figure out ways to make sure that we do that, because leadership, all those things are going to be based on what AI can bring to us and what it can do. And if we don't start getting the bias out of it, none of the things we want to do, none of the things that AI can bring us will be as helpful. And in fact, that can be harmful. So I'm thrilled to see that we are at least thinking about that.
Yeah, thanks, Janet. Christy, over to you.
Yeah, I agree. AI is fascinating, and there's so many possibilities when it is used properly and when we understand that it's designed to really enhance what we are all doing, not replacing. So I think that's something that hopefully will help lower that threat state. The other thing that really stood out for me from what you just shared with us is around that social learning aspect. I think for me, it really reinforces the notion that we all thrive on relatedness and our ability to learn in a way where we're doing it with cohorts, we're doing it with coworkers, we're really benefiting from the knowledge of so many people. I think that really stands out as an important fact for us to all keep in mind, even in the way we're running today's webinar, where people are able to share their insights in the moment. That reinforces everything that we're not only sharing, but it just adds to the experience, adds to the learning, and makes it that much more sticky. So when we build things, when we design training and learning moments with the brain in mind, knowing that when we do this as a group, when we do things with others, it does help all of that knowledge to stick. I think that's really important, especially when I think about within that L&D space. We want to keep in mind and really want to think about what's going to make this training as effective as possible. Every organization has a limited time and limited money. So knowing that, we want to get the full bang for our buck. And I think keeping in mind a lot of social learning experiences is going to help do that. So that really stuck out as something. And that coherence piece, I'm actually going to talk about even more in just a moment. That is so crucial. When things don't match up in our brain and in our experience, we quickly dismiss it. So I'm so glad you brought that up as such an important point.
Yeah, thanks, Christy. I'm reminded of our science that really supports that social learning experience. And for those of you who are listening, write this down. It's this idea of making new information sticky, meaningful, and coherent, right? So sticky, can I recall it in times of stress and pressure, right? So I can enact that new habit. Meaningful, like is it meaningful to me in my day-to-day job? And is it coherent? Is it connected to other things that are, part of the things that I touch? So with that being said, there was a question, John, in the chat box that said, so which of those 4 stats I shared at the beginning is actually true? I left that hanging so that all of you could wonder. The scary statistic is, in fact, that they are all true. So all 4 of those statistics about leadership are true. So that's kind of that hard hitting impact reality for us to really shine a bright light on these realities here. Brilliant. John, over to you.
Hey, thanks. Thank you to this brilliant panel. And Matt, looking at those statistics and really probably the shocking effect it's having on so many of us really helps me to understand why so many folks are interested in the applied neuroscience concept, right? How do we become better at operating at high impact in a VUCA environment? Because we know the brain does not like this level of uncertainty and complexity. And so what is it that we need to know, have, be, and do in order to be high performing in this ever-changing environment? So thank you for helping us to understand the magnitude of the kinds of things that were discussed at Summit. Appreciate that. And so many of you wanted to have a look at this slide again because of its direct impact on us understanding really the leadership and employee crisis that we've really had a sense about. That's fantastic. Thank you for that. Hey, folks, let's go ahead and give you a minute to continue contributing. A number of you already have been putting things in the chat box. Please continue to do that. What stuck out most for you from this chapter of our time together that we just recently spent? What really stuck with you? Go ahead and share in the chat box. No wrong answers, just the right ones. If it's on your mind, we'd like to know it. Go ahead and put that in the chat box. I see a number of you are relating to the VUCA discussion that occurred as well. A number of you were relating to the slide. There was a appreciation for the TORN model that you put up, Matt, and shared with folks. That framework helped to drive additional insights and understanding for folks. Someone shared about BANI world, a brittle, anxious, nonlinear, incomprehensible world. So thank you for sharing that. Yep, another way to look at it. That's great. Some good stuff coming in. Thank you. Continue to provide those in the chat box. We can learn from each other. That's great. I see additional references, resources coming in here. Fantastic. Continue to provide those. We really appreciate it. Fantastic. Good stuff. Great. Hey, folks, let's go ahead now and turn our attention to Christy Pruitt-Haynes. Christy, we'd love to hear from you around the trends and insights that you picked up from your particular practice area as well. It's a great follow-on to the discussion already underway. Christy, over to you.
Thanks, John. So I want to start this conversation with a quote from President Lyndon B. Johnson. He said, "If one morning I walked on top of the water across the Potomac River, the headline that afternoon would read, 'President Can't Swim.'" So the reason I want to start with that is that's how so many employees are feeling in the workplace right now, that no matter what they do, there is a lot of burnout, there's a lot of stress, and that the ultimate takeaway isn't going to be what they did that was superior, like walking on water, but it's going to be some of the problems that exist. And because of that burnout, because of those feelings, we are seeing a really unique time in the workplace. John, if you'll go to the next slide, I'd love to talk a bit about the 2 sessions we had, but then lean into and keep that quote in mind, especially when we talk about cultivating an organization of high performers. So we had a couple of great conversations at Summit. The first was all around the idea of having an organization full of high performers. And so often when we hear that, we think about the problems that it can cause. We think a lot about the competition as opposed to collaboration, and if we even want an organization of all high performers. But in that panel, we talked a lot about how that can work and how impactful it can be, not only for each individual, but for the organization overall. I'm going to talk about that more in just a moment. In our From the Field session, we looked a lot at how organizations have transformed their performance management. There's some right ways and wrong ways to do that, and that's going to depend a lot on where your organization is in its current life cycle, what success really means for your organization. And then we have to think about our employees and how to do this in a way that's going to be both brain-friendly, feed into their needs, but also help them to elevate their performance instead of just assessing that. So again, more on that in just a moment. As we look at our next slide, I want to share a few statistics with you. And keep in mind the quote I just shared, as well as the idea of having an organization of all high performers. So today, across the board, regardless of industry, we are seeing so many indicators that the talent landscape and the experience that team members are having right now in their workplace is less than ideal. It's very interesting. So many people aspire to being promoted, but what we see quite often is after a promotion within a month, almost a third of those people are leaving that organization. We've all heard the phrase quiet quitting, and there are a number of different definitions for it. And there's a bit of controversy, if I'm honest, on what quiet quitting is and if it's good or bad. But almost 60% of our team members are doing that right now, which means they aren't leaning in. They aren't doing everything that they can do. And more importantly, they aren't doing everything that they've traditionally done. And this last stat is one that, as someone who works within the talent and performance space, it causes a tear to well up in my eye. 80% of team members feel that performance management actually demotivates. It doesn't help them perform at their peak. It has that opposite effect. So as we think about trying to create an organization of high performers, then we really need to lean in and think of what are going to be the best ways to do that. And that's one of the things that we talked about in our panel discussion. Couple all of these stats with the notion that employees are feeling more burnout. They are feeling less engagement with their organization than we have traditionally, and are at a point where they feel like no matter what I do, it's not going to be enough. So that kind of creates a perfect storm for us as we think about how to really lift that performance and have an organization where everyone can do their best work. So in that session, we shared some insights and talked a lot with our panelists on what we can do to really create that full organization of high performers. And a few things stood out. As we look at our next slide, we can see some of the insights that came from that. When the goal is to cultivate high performers throughout your organization, and this is for every position and in every way, some of the things that really help us do that: hire slow, move fast, and be clear. What do I mean by that? When you're looking to staff positions, and I have been guilty of this, so please know I am very much lumping myself in this category. There are times where we hire in desperation, but the opposite needs to happen when we're thinking about cultivating high performers. We want to make sure we know exactly the skills we need, and we want to be very thoughtful about recruiting those individuals and bringing them into the organization. So this isn't about hiring the first person who can do it. It's about hiring the person who's going to be best for that role. And that includes, if I'll throw that DEI hat on for a moment, that includes individuals who aren't just a culture fit, but who are going to be a culture add. If you want high performers, you want people who are going to bring something new and unique to your organization. At the same time, oftentimes we may find that someone in a position isn't really performing at their peak. So when that's the case, we have a few options. Obviously, look for ways to develop that talent, but sometimes it means moving them to another position within that organization. Let's identify the strengths that each of our team members have and not be afraid to transition them to a position that's going to better utilize those. I love sharing a story. Years ago, I was the head of HR for an organization, and we had someone who was operating as an executive assistant. As an EA, I'll be honest, she was less than stellar, and that's putting it mildly. But she had some real strengths in her creativity and her strategic thinking. So we moved her to an associate producer position, and she soared. Oftentimes we would have either moved her out of the organization, or what happens, unfortunately, is just ignored the fact that she was underperforming and kind of left her there much longer than we needed to. When we do that, other employees see that we're allowing someone to underperform, and that actually makes them say, why am I working so hard when we're letting this one person stay here and do the bare minimum? So we want to be not afraid to move people fast, and then be clear about expectations, be clear about the goals of the organization and how positions really link to that. We also want to prioritize those positive scarf signals. When we think about high performers, we want to lean into the autonomy. When someone is really good at their job, give them the leeway to do it, and then get out of the way. Autonomy is really important there. We also want to be fair in the way we're doing it. The last example I shared was a great reminder of why that fairness works. When we have people who aren't pulling their full weight, make sure we move them to an opportunity that's going to give them a chance to do that. If not, others resonate that as being less than fair. So playing into that autonomy, allowing people to work in a way that works best for them is so important, particularly with high performers. Our leaders play a vital role in this. Matt shared a lot about the state of leaders right now and leadership in general, but our leaders really help to cultivate high performers. Again, give them their assignments and then move out and let them do it. The role of a leader, particularly when we're dealing with high performers, is to remove barriers that would prevent them from performing at their peak. It also means we have to have those constant conversations around how they're doing. And then the last thing, and I think for me, one of the most insightful, the culture of that organization matters. We run a risk when we have a lot of high performers. We get a whole lot of those type A's in one position, and it becomes really easy for everyone to be very competitive instead of being collaborative. And we need that collaboration. So make sure your organization has a culture of collaboration. Make sure you reward collaboration, you reward innovation, you reward all of those things to reinforce those behaviors so you don't end up with a situation where you have a lot of team members that are bumping heads and competing with each other instead of collaborating. So as we move to our next session and look at our next set of slides, we talked a lot about transforming performance management. But when we think about that, we want to think a bit about what are we transforming from and to. So a lot of performance management systems are currently set up to just recognize or reward those high performers. And that's important. We want to do that. But instead, to make it really effective and really impactful, your performance management system should help create and enable high performers. It's a subtle difference, but it really matters a lot. So some of the insights we had from this phenomenal conversation as we look to our next slide, we heard from several of our clients, including Cohesity, Microsoft, and Albemarle, on how they have transformed their performance management system and what really worked well for them. So a few things that stood out from that conversation, and Matt started us on this track. Coherence is critical. Your performance management system has to marry up with the other systems in your organization. As an example, if you say collaboration is important, then your performance management system needs to reward collaboration. If you say innovation is important, then your performance management system needs to reward that. What you do, what you say, what you do, and what you reward has to match up. Your performance management system should also marry up to your career mobility process and even to your talent acquisition. Again, when those things don't match up, employees tend to lean into what they think will be rewarded as opposed to what you say is most important. So our panelists talk a lot about creating that coherence. We also think a lot about performance management and want to talk about conversations. And we know conversations are critical. That's where we share feedback. That's where we talk about opportunities. That's where people really learn. So we really want to prioritize both the quality of those conversations and the quantity. A proper PM system isn't just a one and done thing. It's not a conversation you have once a year and then you don't think about it. It's that constant conversations, it's those constant touch points and that constant feedback. But it also has to be high quality. You want to make sure that what you're sharing really is impactful, really helps people to demonstrate where they need to move. And then finally, keep it simple. Don't have a complicated process because our jobs are complicated enough. So when you think about transforming your performance management, make it as simple as possible. Make sure the technology supports what you want to do, and make sure that you're over communicating what's expected and really giving everybody the time and space to lean into that system. So I know I've shared a lot. I would love to hear Matt, Janet, and John, what's bubbling up for you as we talk about these two sessions?
I can jump in, Janet.
Go ahead.
Something
Go
that
ahead,
comes to
Matt.
mind, if that's all right.
Go ahead.
Christy, I'm reminded of what we heard at the summit last week in New York, and that was a comment from Dr. Amy Edmondson from Harvard Business School. And she said, and I wrote this down, and you all know what I'm about to say because it hit us all equally. And that was, don't allow the problems above you become the problems below you. And it's connected to what you're saying here, Christy, because leaders are responsible for removing the barriers for high performers, right? As you said. And leaders are accountable for leveraging skill sets or gaining new skill sets to enable that. And so to enable, the abilities of high performers and to build other performers to become high performers. So I'll say it again, don't allow the problems above you become the problems below you. So leaders, do your job.
And what comes up for me, Krista, you brought in the DEI part of it, and you and I have talked often about how these things are not separate. They have to be the same. So when you talk about high performers, what comes up for me is we have to redefine what high performer means. I think we have some standard opinions of what that is, but to your point, if you redefine high performer for culture add and not culture fit, it might change the way people talk about it. It might change what people look for. And part of what you do then is if you redefine that, you got to have the metrics, you got to know, you got to point to where problems are happening with the metrics, disaggregated data, all those things. So that when you start talking about high performers, which generally leads into then who you develop and who you promote, we have to think about diversity in there. We have to think about DEI there. We have to make sure that we are looking at DEI as we look at these traditional things like high performance and all that. So we look at those. And one of the last things you said, I think underscores that is you have to do what you say and you have to reward what you care about. So one of the issues that always gets in the way of DEI is accountability. So if we are redefining what high performer means, if we are disaggregating our data so we can figure out that who is being determined a high performer and then is promoted and developed as a result of that, then we have to do those if we believe and if we as organizations say that we care about DEI. That is how you manifest what you say. And that's how you show that you are practicing the principles that you put out there in the world.
Brilliant. Wow. Hey, folks, I don't know about you, but listening to these three awesome panelists is giving me great insight as to, why 65% of the Fortune 100 companies are leveraging the NeuroLeadership Institute to help figure out and solve some of these issues, and also why the summit is been such a popular event on an annual basis. Hey, continue to share your insights in the chat box and your questions and answers. Your questions as well, please, so that we can have an opportunity to interact with you now in our remaining time together. I love the insights that are coming in. Thank you so much for your participation there, and keep those coming. Panelists, I'm wondering, as I was listening to all of you speak, and you were this whole idea of coherence, and I'm putting on my hat as a former leader in an organization, wondering to myself, how do I know if I have coherence? I mean, how do I figure out if that's an issue for me or something I need to pay attention to? I'm wondering what your thoughts are.
Well, I'll quickly share. One of the first things is if what you say is important, you aren't seeing in your organization, then chances are there's some decoherence there. So if you've listed out, these are the values, this is how we want people to work, that sort of thing, but you see so many of your team members acting in the opposite way, typically it's because what you're rewarding isn't actually what you're saying matters. So a great example is you may say we want people to work together, but then the person who gets promoted is the one who was cutthroat and out for themselves and that sort of thing. People notice that, so that's what they're going to lean into. So looking at all of your systems, all of your talent systems, from talent acquisition to performance to even compensation and benefits, and comparing those across the board, seeing how they marry up to what you've said is most important. How do they link directly to what you've stated as your organizational goals? And identifying any of those spots that don't quite match up is going to be really important. And when in doubt, we can help you do that. So to throw in that 3-second sales plug, that's one of the things we do with so many of our clients, because it's an important part of identifying where the real issues lie, so we can then have very targeted solutions to help with that.
And I'll piggyback on what Chrissy just said. When you are trying to figure out whether you're coherent, data is your biggest asset. It proves what's working, what's not working. It proves whether or not you are actually doing what you say you want people to do. And it gives you the opportunity to make people accountable for whether or not they're doing it. And to Christy's point, that is key to making sure that if you're going to live out what you say, you got to be able to prove that people are or not doing it. So to me, data is the best way to look at whether or not you have coherence, because if you don't, the data will show that.
Excellent.
Yeah, well said. Christy, Jan, a quick comment on that. You know, from our perspective, from the science lens at the NeuroLeadership Institute, when we talk about coherence, the question we have to ask ourselves is, does this fit together with other organizational priorities and some of the established work processes we see in the organization and in the environment? And if it doesn't, why are we doing it, right? And so if there's no natural intersect, if there's no enablement of, let's say, those habits that are at scale, like I said earlier, one habit at a time across the whole organization, if there's no coherence there in the systems that enable those habits that align to the key priorities of the organization, you're not going to change anything. Thanks.
Right. Thank you. You know, as our time is winding down, you all have given us remarkably important and significant information as we recap this most successful summit. I'm wondering, though, if you have got, one piece of advice that we can walk away with for organizations. I mean, if I were still in another organization, what would you tell me? What one piece of advice would you tell me as we're wrapping up our time together? Janet, we'll start with you.
DEI is here to stay. Don't be scared. It's a correction, not a catastrophe. Play the long game.
Awesome. Thank you, Janet. Matt, how about you?
Yeah, I think let's embrace technology to further support and invest in our human capital, in our leadership pipelines for the future, so that we can close the gap that is coming as a tidal wave for leaders leaving organizations. Leverage the technology as an extension of our thinking, not as a replacement of our thinking. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. Thank you. Christy?
Yes, I'll go with what's on the screen right now with number one. Coherence is critical. Make sure all of your systems really reinforce the goals of your organization. And if they don't be afraid to change those. Keep it simple, over communicate them, but you have to make sure your employees have a clear picture of what success looks like and what it is you need from them, and that you reinforce those behaviors.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you all so much. We really appreciate your willingness to so openly share your knowledge and data and information in recapping this most recent summit. At this point, I'd like to tee up and hand over to Shelby as we get into one of our new features here in Your Brain at Work. Shelby, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, John and Matt and Christy and Janet. That was an incredible conversation. And I think those insights were really impactful. So we're looking forward to seeing how you all feel about them. And thank you for sharing your thoughts in the chat. So now it's time to experiment bravely. We've never done this before, but because we want to continue partnering with our research team and gain insights from you, we are going to have a polling experience at the end of each session that will incorporate different solutions and topics that we want to collect data around. So we are going to start that today. So for the next few minutes, just pay attention to your screens. We're going to give you time, try to answer the questions as quickly as you can. We'll give about 10 to 15 seconds per each question, but the goal is to just collect some data from you. So I will let that stay up for a moment, and then I'll come back on with some final announcements. All right, thank you so much for your answers. We love to see them coming in. And these will be new questions every week, so make sure that you tune in. And now, John, if you just want to send it on to the next slide, we'll do our closing announcements. So our final poll that we'll put up is our normal poll as always. Let NLI know how we can help you in the future. If you're interested in solutions and information, please let us know in that final poll. Insider exchange. This is specifically for senior executives. So if you enjoy your Brain at Work Live, we think you'll love our NLI Insider program. We invite you to join this exclusive opportunity where you can enjoy benefits of having first looks at new research, roundtable discussions with our leaders, and to have insight into what's coming next. So to apply, you can visit the link in the chat and our podcast. So obviously this is a live webinar show that we have, but we also translate these recordings into podcasts. We are also going to be doing some new formatting this season for our podcast and having some new segments that aren't on your Brain at Work Live. So stay tuned for that. We'll be sharing more on our social channels. And that's where we end this session. So thank you so much for joining us. We're happy to be back for season 10, and we cannot wait to share what we have in store. So have a great weekend, and we'll see you here next Friday.